Hi, good evening, everyone. Today we are here with one of our deep dive sessions. As you know, the US has recently attacked Venezuela. It's almost an invasion, but not a long-term one. So today we are going to go into the background of this right from the start. Okay, we are going to look into the causes. We are going to look at Operation Absolute Resolve, through which the United States captured, or rather abducted, the president of Venezuela and the first lady. Okay, so let's make a start. I have a PowerPoint behind me, and I have some interesting audio clips and video clips of Trump and other figures. So we're going to go into a deep dive. We're going to do the terminology which is important related to this topic, and we are going to see the events of this crisis. Okay, so let me first give you a preview. So what are we going to take a look at today? We are going to take a look at a bit of history and background of Venezuela, which I've broadly titled Oil and Its Discontents, the role of the vast oil reserves that Venezuela has. We are going to take a look at the broad background of US-Venezuela relations, about the conflict in the past, the sanctions, the legal cases. We are going to see a bit of electoral history and what is the scene of the opposition in the country. You must have also seen that one of the major opposition leaders won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. And the year before that, two major opposition leaders won the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize. So we'll see details about that. The actual operation, which is Absolute Resolve. We are going to take a look at Trump's statement, we are going to run the country. Okay, this is a blatantly colonial or imperial kind of a project. So we'll see what are the reactions, what's the future going to look like, and finally a few important terminologies which are important with relation to this crisis. So that's what's on the agenda today. So let's first begin with a bit of history and background. The person you see here is Simon Bolivar, who is a very important figure in the history of South America. So let's see a bit of background. So the oldest thing is the Treaty of Tordesillas, okay, in which Spain and Portugal between themselves decided which parts of the world we are going to colonize. So Spain agreed that the Western Hemisphere would be for Spain to colonize, and Portugal agreed that the Eastern Hemisphere would be for it to colonize. Okay, so in 1522, the region, not just Venezuela, but its neighboring countries as well, were colonized by Spain. Okay, we don't have to go into too much detail during this period, but next it's important to know this key figure, Simon Bolivar, who is also known as El Libertador, or the Liberator of America. Okay, he is significant for having led the Colombian War of Independence. Now you might be confused because Colombia is a separate country, but don't be confused. At that time, the entire region, of course, there were distinct peoples in these, what later became countries, but in terms of gaining independence from Spain, they were united. Okay, so Simon Bolivar led that movement, the Colombian War of Independence. Okay, so initially, independence was declared from Spain in the year 1811, and then officially from 1819, the Grand Colombia or Grand Colombia, larger Colombia, or the Republic of Colombia was established. This comprised not just Venezuela, but also modern-day Colombia and other neighboring countries. Okay. Ultimately, Venezuela got independence from the Republic of Colombia as well. That's in the year 1830. Now, there's a lot of time I have fast forwarded in this period, but the next key thing for you to remember, there was one constitution for Venezuela in the 1960s, and which was finally replaced by the current constitution, which is the 1999 constitution. And at this time, it was Hugo Chavez who was the leader of Venezuela. And under him, the transition to a new constitution took place in the year 1999. Okay. Now, the events of modern day basically start from Maduro. There's, of course, a long history of US intervention in South America as well. But in terms of Maduro, he comes to power in the 2010s. Okay, so we are going to take a look at that. But first, let's just see a few basic details. So what's the capital of Venezuela? It is the city of Caracas. Okay, and its parliament is called the National Assembly. Now that Maduro has been captured or abducted by the United States, the vice president has become the acting president. So the current acting head of state is Delcy Rodriguez. Okay. Now, officially, what is the structure of the country? It's a federal presidential republic. Okay. This is something to keep in mind. It's formally or officially a democracy, but for the past many years, it has effectively functioned as a dictatorship, as an authoritarian dictatorship. Okay. In terms of other key details, as I mentioned, it was previously a colony of Spain, then gained independence as part of Republic of Colombia, and finally gained independence from them as well. Okay. Its official language is Spanish. That's the language spoken by the majority of the population. And the currency is called Bolivar, after the famous founding father, Simon Bolivar. Okay. And this is why, by the way, the official name of the country is the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. It is after Simon Bolivar. Okay. So those are just some key facts before we get into the current dispute. Okay. Finally, just have a quick look at this map in front of you. So these are some other important facts to keep in mind. Okay. So the highest waterfall in the world, which is the Angel Falls, also falls within Venezuela. Okay. The second important detail, and perhaps, or not perhaps, really a key cause of instability in Venezuela is that it has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Approximately 17% of the world's total oil reserves, proven oil reserves, have been discovered in the country of Venezuela. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind. I sort of named it earlier, the oil and its discontents. This has been the cause of the US's intervention in the country as well. Okay, there are officially other reasons, formally other reasons, especially relating to drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. But if we look behind it, if we take a realist perspective, at the end of the day, most wars in the world are essentially wars for resources. Okay. Moving on, just a few other details before we reach the meat of the issue. So the longest mountain range in the world, the Andes, also falls partly in this country. So I've just flagged that. The grasslands which are found in this country are called llanos. Now you may be wondering why I'm telling you all of this, but you all know in both CLAT and AILET, there's a bit of unpredictability. And so there are a lot of times details like this that are asked in the exam. Okay. Finally, of course, there are many countries which neighbor Venezuela in terms of maritime borders. But when we talk of land borders, what are the three main countries which border Venezuela? One is Colombia to the west, Brazil to the south, and Guyana to the east. Okay, so these are the three main land borders of Venezuela. As you can see, Trinidad and Tobago is also quite close to the country in terms of the maritime border. And most of the coast of Venezuela falls on the Caribbean Sea. So that's important to remember. Of course, part of it then is the Atlantic Ocean to the east. Okay, so that's in terms of the geography. The primary river in this country, which you can see here, is the Rio Orinoco. Okay, so those are some key geographical facts for you to keep in mind. Out of these, I would say the most significant are the first two, that the highest waterfall in the world is in Venezuela, and second, that the largest proven oil reserves in the world are in Venezuela. Okay, so that covers a whole bunch of the background. Now, as I told you, we need to see a little bit about the electoral history. When does Nicolás Maduro come on the scene? Okay, so after the death of Hugo Chavez, the popular president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro becomes the president of Venezuela in the year 2013. Okay, now after this, two presidential elections primarily have taken place, one in 2018 and one in 2024. Now, in both elections, there are a lot of disputes. The opposition, as well as non-partisan human rights organizations, have said that both of these elections were essentially rigged. Okay, as I said, officially it's a democracy, but in effect, it has been run as an authoritarian dictatorship with all the tactics which accompany such a title. That is to say, disqualification of opposition candidates, arrests of opposition candidates, right? Lawfare, right? What we call lawfare, warfare and law. It's a portmanteau of those words. Lawfare against the opposition and so on and so forth. Okay, so because of that, it's considered an authoritarian dictatorship by most scholars in the world. And so the elections of 18 and 24 are highly disputed, and it is not clear at all if Maduro legitimately won. Okay, so in 2018, the victory is disputed, right? Officially, Maduro is declared the winner. Now, 2024 is the most recent one, right? Here again, the election victory is disputed. Who was the primary candidate against Nicolás Maduro? His name is Edmundo Gonzalez. Okay, he was the leader of the opposition. I'm going to show you a picture of him pretty soon. Okay, so just keep in mind, most sources across the world agree that it is Edmundo Gonzalez who actually won this election. Okay, and that Maduro effectively stole the election. All right. In fact, the USA recognized that Edmundo Gonzalez is the legitimate winner of the election, right? Before Biden ended his term and before Trump began his term, the US had recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as the legitimate. Okay, at the bottom here, I have exactly what I said earlier. Though officially a democracy, effectively an authoritarian dictatorship. Okay, so that is the lay of the land. Now let's have a look at this next slide. As I mentioned earlier, in this picture here, you see Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado. Okay, so both of them together won the Sakharov Prize. Now remember, what is the Sakharov Prize? This is important because it's announced each year. It's an important prize, one of the top human rights prizes in the world. So it's named after Andrei Sakharov. And who awards the Sakharov Prize? It is the European Parliament, which is one of the organs of the European Union. So in 2024, the Sakharov Prize for the freedom of thought was given to the opposition leaders of Venezuela, Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado. As I said, in 2024, most non-partisan organizations believe that it is Edmundo Gonzalez who won the election against Maduro. Though, of course, officially it was certified for Maduro. Okay. Now, the latest is that in late 2025, Maria Corina Machado was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, the timing seems slightly suspect, I believe, to most people. But just last year, it was announced that she won the Nobel Peace Prize for her fight for democracy in Venezuela. Okay, so that's a bit of the recent background. And of course, now remember, when we talk about Venezuela, two things can be true at once. Number one, Venezuela is not a democratic country, at least it hasn't been in the last 2 decades. It was run as a dictatorship by Nicolás Maduro. He stole elections. This can be true. At the same time, it can also be true that the US illegally, unlawfully violating international law, effectively invaded that country and abducted or captured its president and first lady, charged them in domestic courts, and brought them away to the United States. So both of these things can be true. Always remember, two wrongs do not make a right. Okay, so let's have a look now at Operation Absolute Resolve. Okay, so what I've done, as you know, Trump's government is a government by tweet. So most important things are announced by tweets. So I've extracted a bunch of them. This was posted by the White House. And the title, as you can see, is Operation Absolute Resolve. Okay. So this is the name of the operation. So very significant from a GK and current affairs perspective. The name of the operation is vital to remember. So Operation Absolute Resolve is the name of the military operation conducted by the United States in order to capture or abduct Nicolás Maduro, as well as his wife, the First Lady, Celia Flores. Okay. Now, in this picture, I just want you to know a few officials. So, of course, in the center, you have the President, Donald Trump. You should know the name of this guy who's standing behind him. He is the Secretary of State. Okay, now remember, in the US, the Secretary of State is the title held by their foreign minister or external affairs minister. Okay, so Secretary of State, you have to know his name. His name is Marco Rubio. Okay, and their Secretary of War, okay, is Pete Hegseth. Okay, so both of these cabinet officials of Trump you have to know about. So Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State and Pete Hegseth is the Secretary of War. Till some time back, this department used to be called the Department of Defense, but its name was changed by Trump to the Department of War. Okay, so keep in mind, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. Now, let's come to this slide. So I have here the main tweet and then the later press conference. So let's hear a bit of this press conference. Okay, just a second. So in this conference, effectively, Trump said it is one of the most powerful displays of American military might. Now, let's just see the announcement. So Trump said the US has conducted a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolás Maduro, who, along with his wife, has been captured and flown out of the country. This operation was done in conjunction with US law enforcement. Okay, and then, of course, he held a press conference. All right. Now, as you can see, a few salient details stand out. Okay, what are those details? He calls it a law enforcement action. Okay, so this is something that Trump stated, basically to skirt international law as well as US domestic law. So what the US did is to basically call it a law enforcement action, saying that Maduro and his wife are wanted criminals in the US for violating US domestic laws. And so, in order to effectuate that, we can go arrest and capture. Okay, so let's see if we can hear a little bit of this conference. Okay, I'm not sure. Okay, anyway, that's all right. Let's now move on to the next slide. So we are going to see the details of international law as well as US domestic law, which was violated. Okay, so just the key details. What do you have to remember? The name of the operation, Operation Absolute Resolve. The date is the 2nd of January 2025. So a very poor start to the new year and a very poor portent for the rest of the world. What was the primary target? Now, there were airstrikes, mainly in the capital, which is Caracas, as well as in other parts of northern Venezuela. Okay, so this is important as well. Next, main outcome, abduction or capture of Nicolás Maduro, as well as his wife, the First Lady, Celia Flores. As of now, there is no reported death count from the US side. And on the other side, Venezuelan sources have reported that approximately 80 people, more than 80 people have died from Venezuela and Cuba. Now, you might be wondering how Cuba is involved. Actually, the Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, his team of bodyguards is mainly staffed by Cuban military officers. Okay, so that is why Venezuelan and Cuban casualties number more than 80 people as per Venezuelan sources. Okay, so as I've said on the title, do we call it an abduction? Do we call it capture? Right? Capture is a more neutral term. Abduction is what many in the world are describing this as. And in fact, the vice president, who we will see in a moment, who is now the acting president, she described it as a kidnap. Okay, as you can see, Trump posted this as well. Nicolás Maduro on board the USS Iwo Jima, right? So this is after his capture or abduction. They were brought on board the carrier USS Iwo Jima and from there flown into the United States. Okay, here is a picture of Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, who were the objects of this mission. Their capture or abduction was the core objective of this particular US mission. Okay, now let's have a look at the pretext. Now, what does the word pretext mean? By it, I simply mean the official narrative. Official on whose part? On the US's part. So the US's story is that this is a law enforcement action. It is not an invasion or a military action. Okay, so this, as I told you, is there to skirt domestic law. So what had happened is, in Trump's first term, during Trump's first term, they had issued an indictment in the year 2020. And now they issued a superseding indictment in the year 2026. Now, what is an indictment, you might be wondering, right? So in the US, the criminal law process follows a very specific route. First, there is a grand jury, which is just a collection of ordinary citizens. The prosecutors present the charges to this collection of ordinary citizens called the grand jury. And if the grand jury feels there is enough to move forward, then an indictment is issued. Okay, and an indictment is essentially a formal charge, right? After which the trial process begins. So the US indicted Maduro and his wife, his son, and other people in 2020, and now again in 2026. This is why the US's stance is that we are simply enforcing our domestic law and we went to apprehend these wanted criminals. In fact, even during Biden's time in office, and even before that, during Trump's first term, they had officially announced a bounty of several $1 million for the capture of Maduro as well. Okay? All right. Now, let's just a moment. Let's move on. As you can see on the previous slide, you also see a phrase here called narco state. So the allegation of the United States is that Venezuela is effectively a narco state. What does that mean? It means that the narcotics trafficking organizations, the criminal organizations, as well as the government of that country are in cahoots with each other and effectively function as the governing authority of the country. So effectively, the allegation is that the government of the country of Venezuela and the drug trafficking organizations, the criminal organizations, are effectively blended into one. That is the idea of calling it a narco state. All right. Let's now come to the indictment. Okay, as I mentioned, an indictment is like a formal charging of a person by a grand jury. A grand jury is a collection of citizens to which charges are presented by the prosecutors. If they approve, things can move forward. Okay, so please keep this in mind. Now, what I've extracted here is just from the title page of the latest indictment. As you can see, Nicolás Maduro, the first one is the president. The fourth name here is his wife, Celia Flores. And among others, even Maduro's son has been indicted. Okay, so in pursuance of these criminal charges in the domestic courts of the United States, the US has conducted Operation Absolute Resolve. Okay, now what are the charges against him? Okay, so you can see on the side here, these are the criminal charges presented. So count 1 is the narco-terrorism conspiracy. Count 2 is a cocaine importation conspiracy. Okay, count 3 is possession of machine guns and destructive devices. And count 4 is the conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices. These are the criminal charges that have been laid against Maduro and his wife. Okay. At the core of it, at the core of the allegations by the United States are charges relating to narcotics trafficking, particularly cocaine as well. Okay. And as I said, the idea is to call Venezuela a narco state. That is what the US calls Venezuela. And the core idea being that the politicians who run the country and the criminal drug trafficking gangs are one and the same, and they control the entire nation, right? And that is why the US has indicted the president and his wife on charges of narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is the logic of the US's action, that these people are wanted criminals in our domestic courts, and therefore we have gone and arrested. Okay, so the US is trying not to call it a military action or an invasion or anything of that sort. All right.
So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
Trump said the dramatic overnight operation knocked out elections.
All right. So you heard Trump here. This is from his press conference after the operation. He said, we are going to run the country. This is what he said after the operation was conducted. Okay. Now, this does not just suggest that this was simply a law enforcement action to apprehend wanted criminals, the president and his wife. This suggests that the US's objectives are more aligned with regime change, and it is an attempt to change the people who rule Venezuela, who control Venezuela. And ultimately, and Trump has said this openly, that at the end of the day, it is about oil. Okay, so please keep that in mind. Now, what I have done on the side here is laid out a few terms which are important. You are going to see these in various editorials which are written. So it's very important from the perspective of the exam, right? We have the words imperialism, colonialism, and neo-colonialism, right? All of these words, which many would have said were things of the past, are really things which exist in the present time. Okay, so you can see the definitions here. What I've done is to simply lay out the basic definitions from Britannica, from Oxford Dictionary, and so on and so forth. But these are words you will find squarely applicable to the situation. Okay. All right. Let's now come to the next. So what has happened after Maduro was captured or abducted? Of course, there's a power vacuum. So the person who was the vice president, her name is Delcy Rodriguez. She was sworn in as the acting president. Okay. The vice presidents in Venezuela are not elected. So she was handpicked by Maduro himself. In fact, her brother also serves as the president of the National Assembly of Venezuela, which is effectively their parliament. Okay. So please keep this in mind. She has been sworn in as acting president. Things are in a stalemate as of now. Okay. So it's important to know that there have been noises made from both sides. Her saying we are open to talking to the US administration under Trump. On the other hand, the US has said stuff like that she is willing to collaborate with us. Okay. But these things are just statements from both sides. How these things actually play out will be something to be seen. Okay. Now, there was talk. What about Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize winner? Could she now lead the country? She has, of course, been in exile in Europe ever since arrest warrants were issued against her in Venezuela by the Maduro regime. Okay. So please keep that in mind. But Trump has said that he does not think that Maria Corina Machado will be able to lead the country since she does not have the requisite support. Okay. Next, we have to talk about this important word, the Monroe Doctrine, which Trump has now dubbed the Donroe Doctrine. Okay.
All the way back, it dated to the Monroe Doctrines. And the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Donroe Document. I don't know.
All right. So that's just to give you a little bit of the flavor. Now, what is the Monroe Doctrine? So this doctrine was basically laid out by the US President James Monroe way back in 1823. As you'll remember from our earlier timeline, this is around the time that the South American nations were gaining independence from their colonial masters, essentially Spain as well as other countries. Okay. So at this time, the US also was in its infancy, and the then US President James Monroe essentially laid out this doctrine to say that this hemisphere is the US's sphere of influence. But remember, the core logic of the Monroe Doctrine was that the European powers should not interfere colonially in the Americas. Okay, that was the original objective of the Monroe Doctrine. So if I take you through these, what was the Monroe Doctrine? So James Monroe laid out that the US would not interfere in the internal affairs or wars of Europe. The US recognized and would not interfere with colonies which existed at this time. The Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization. So that was the core of the Monroe Doctrine, that the European powers should not try to increase their influence in the Americas, should not try to colonize new regions and new countries. As you'll remember, US itself was part of the British colonial empire and had gained its independence barely 50 years before the advent of the Monroe Doctrine. And finally, James Monroe, by laying out this doctrine, had stated that any attempt by a European power to oppress or control any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. Okay, so remember, the core of the Monroe Doctrine was to prevent further colonial action by European powers in the US's sphere of influence, which is the Western Hemisphere, the Americas. Okay, And you can see here this chart effectively, which was posted once again by the White House, saying this is our hemisphere. Okay, so this doctrine, which was supposed or which was originally meant to curb colonialism from the European powers, has now been pressed into service by Donald Trump, rebranded the Donroe doctrine, since his name is Donald Trump, and is essentially being used by the US to further the imperialist or colonialist objectives of the United States. Okay, so it's quite a bastardization of the Monroe Doctrine, and that's basically it. As you can tell from the content of the Monroe Doctrine, it was not meant to further colonial imperial action by any country. It was meant to curb European colonial action. Okay. Anyway, Trump has now dubbed it the Donroe Doctrine, saying that the Western Hemisphere is the US's sphere of influence. What is unsaid is that the US is effectively saying that in our sphere of influence, we are free to do as we please, right? Okay. Let's now talk a little bit about international law. Okay. So most people have taken all kinds of positions, really. Some have celebrated the fact that a dictator, the Venezuelan dictator, Nicolás Maduro, is now no longer in power. Whereas others have focused on the fact that the actions of the United States here are illegal and they violate international law. So if we look at the core objectives of the UN in Article 2 of the UN Charter, it says that the organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. Now, the US action of violating Venezuelan airspace, Venezuelan land, and the capture of its sitting president and the first lady, certainly a violation of the sovereignty of Venezuela. And see the other point in Article 2, that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Okay, so both of these core provisions of the United Nations Charter, which are effectively part of general international law, both of these provisions seem to be violated by this US action. Now, thinking in terms of the realpolitik, thinking as a realist, one would say that in international affairs, especially in big power politics, right? In a now unipolar or bipolar world, actions of the big countries are almost always dictated by their own self-interest and not by rules of international law. Yet we have these principles of international law, which certainly seem to be violated, right? Now, other than this, now one thing I want you to keep in mind is that the United States is not a state party to the Rome Statute. What is the Rome Statute? That is the instrument which creates the International Criminal Court. In fact, most big countries, including the US, Russia, India, Pakistan, China, Israel, none of these countries are state parties to the Rome Statute. What does the Rome Statute contemplate? The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court contemplates individual responsibility of political and military leaders for international crimes. Now, what are these international crimes? These are the crimes of genocide, war crimes, the crime of aggression, and the crimes against humanity. Okay, out of these, the one I want to focus on is the crime of aggression. Okay, keep in mind that the US is not a party to the Rome Statute, but ever since World War II, and according to the Allied powers, ever since the 1920s, a general principle of international law has existed that aggressive war is prohibited. Certainly after the advent of the United Nations An aggressive war is something that is not permitted. Okay, so let me read out to you a bit of the definition here. So what it says is that the crime of aggression means the planning, preparation, initiation, or execution of an act of aggression which by its character, gravity, and scale constitutes a manifest violation of the Charter of the United Nations. Okay, so somewhat vague, but let's see what it includes. So it describes what are potential acts of aggression. So I haven't extracted the whole thing, but if we just see this part of it, the invasion or attack by the armed forces of a state of the territory of another state, or any military occupation, however temporary, resulting from an invasion or attack, or any annexation by the use of force of the territory of another state or part of it, as well as bombardment by the armed forces of a state against the territory of another state. Essentially, if we look at it in a very fundamental way, what is an aggressive war? An aggressive war is a war without just cause. What could be a possible just cause? Self-defense, right? That is not exactly in play here. Okay, so what the US has done can clearly be classified as an act of aggression. Okay, so I just wanted to flag this for you as well. The US's actions are manifestly a violation of the principles of international law as they have evolved over the years. Okay, now, in fact, what is interesting is that this is also a violation of US domestic law. Okay, the US Constitution requires that only Congress or their parliament can declare war on another country. Okay, now this is something that has not been done. There is no declaration of war against Venezuela by the Congress of the United States. Okay, now this is why Trump and his administration state that it was a law enforcement operation, meaning it is not a war. These are people who are criminals who need to be apprehended in order to be brought to justice in our domestic courts. And so we have gone and captured them, just like we would arrest any other person. The fallback defense is that from the time of 9/11, the Congress had authorized the executive branch of the US to conduct operations in the war against terrorism. Okay, so you will notice that one of the key indictments against Maduro is that of a narco-terrorism conspiracy, right? So the main defense is this is not a war, this is simply a law enforcement action. But the fallback defense essentially is that they would be covered by the authorization for the use of force, which was issued in pursuance of the war on terror after 9/11. Okay, all right. Let's now, before we wrap up, I just wanted to flag a few reactions. This is a portrait from his court appearance. So Maduro said, "I am the president of Venezuela, and I consider myself a prisoner of war. I was captured at my home in Caracas." And when he was brought before the court in the Southern District of New York, he stated that he is not guilty and he pled not guilty to the crime. Now, whatever be the merit of those allegations in terms of criminal law, the action of the United States to invade the sovereign space and territory of Venezuela to capture or abduct its sitting president and first lady certainly is a violation of international law. I've already stated, of course, that Maduro is no saint, but that does not justify the action of the United States. As I said, two wrongs do not make a right. Okay. Delcy Rodriguez, the acting president, stated that Venezuela will never again be anyone's colony. neither of old empires, a reference to Spain, nor of new empires, possibly a reference to the United States, nor of empires in decline. This is a reference to the idea that the US is an empire in decline. Okay, so that was the official reaction. Delcy Rodriguez also officially stated, at least, that the president of Venezuela is one, his name is Nicolás Maduro, which is why she is the acting president. Now, this is public posturing. We don't know the reality of the negotiations behind the scenes. So that will be something to look out for. In fact, there has also been some reporting by certain news organizations that her brother, who is the president of the National Assembly, had been in negotiations with the United States for a deal by which Maduro would go into exile and she would become the president. So that is some reporting. There is no verification of this, nor is there likely to be complete verification of it. But just keep this fact in mind as well. Okay? But her official reaction is that of condemnation against the United States, though she has indicated she is willing to work with the United States to figure out the path forward. Right? The future seems to be dark. It is uncertain. Trump, in his press conference, also stated that Cuba could be next, and Greenland could be next, and Colombia could be next, and Mexico could be next. One would hope that all of that does not come to pass. But what Trump's action has shown is that the big powers always act in their self-interest, whether it accords with international law or not. Right? Similarly, Russia invaded Ukraine without just cause. The US effectively invaded Venezuela and abducted its president without any just cause. Right? International law, remember, has always been on a somewhat weak footing. Right? If you just see who has actually been prosecuted by the International Criminal Court, you'll see they are leaders of developing and underdeveloped countries. Right? Whereas certainly the United States for a long time has interfered with the sovereign functions of many countries across the world. Right? It's the classic invasion of Iraq, right, is a key example in terms of US adventurism across the world. I'll end with the somewhat tepid statement issued by the United Nations. The Secretary General, of course, issued the statement saying that these developments constitute a dangerous precedent and that he is deeply concerned that the rules of international law have not been respected. Far from a forceful condemnation, but in any case, at least he flagged that international law has been violated. I want to wrap up effectively on that note that the future of international law seems to be uncertain. These seem to be the last several years, actually. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, Israel's genocide in Gaza, the latest action by the United States in Venezuela, and the abduction of its president, all seem to be, examples of the dying gasps of international law, right? As when I was teaching in class a few days back, one of the students asked, "But sir, then are there no rules?" And that's basically right? A realist foreign policy perspective would show that countries effectively act in their self-interest, governed by their geopolitical and strategic strength. Okay, so let me wrap up here. That effectively was a brief on the US attack on Venezuela, whereby it conducted Operation Absolute Resolve and captured or abducted the president and first lady of Venezuela. So that's it for now. Once we see some more updates, more developments over the next few weeks, I'll come back to you with an updated version. This seems to me to be a very important topic. I feel that there are going to be significant developments through the course of this year, and which is why we have to keep an eye out on this topic from the perspective of all entrance exams, which ask general knowledge and current affairs. So despite the topic, it was my pleasure to bring to you this deep dive, and I hope to see you all very soon once again.